Hello again, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mina Alikani. I have the pleasure and honor of moderating this session. I'm joined by my co-host, Natalie Silverman, who is a professional broadcaster. So I'm all embarrassed about how I perform in this.
Great job.
And she's a former fertility patient and has spent the last 8 years producing the Fertility Podcast to educate and empower patients on their family building journey. And also as panelists, we have Christianna Makri, head of CRYOSTORAGE for a very large clinic in Greece, the Institute of Life. Christianna recently presented her findings on legacy samples at the Fertility 2002 meeting, discussing detailed auditing as a tool to determine clinic policy on sample management and ongoing demands. We also have with us Charissa Watchorn. She is the laboratory manager and a senior embryologist at Southampton's Complete Fertility Center, which is a member of Virtuous Health. And we have Cynthia Hudson, who is the VP of Clinical Strategy at Tomorrow and has been present in many of these sessions, so I'm sure you're familiar with her. The full bios of everyone is available on the i3 website, and I encourage you to look at these bios if you're interested in knowing more about our wonderful panelists and speakers. Natalie, to you.
Thank you, Mina, who needs no introduction to this crowd. You know her as the distinguished scientist devoting 35 years as a clinical embryologist, focusing on improving IVF laboratory performance and outcomes via meticulous practice, detailed observation, embracing of new and bold technologies, and teaching and training of others to do the same. Also, Mina now is president of the Alpha Society of Reproductive Biologists. We are in great company. In turn, I'd like to introduce our third expert panelist from the UK, Anastasia Mania, who is the lab manager of King's Fertility in London. Anastasia is passionate about improving pregnancy outcomes and applying the latest research to her clinical work while caring for the patient. But without further ado, we're going to move on to our first speaker. And as Mina said, all the speaker bios are on the i3 website because we've got so much to go through. We didn't want to take up all the time telling you about them. Do go and check them out. I'm going to welcome Michael Collins. Michael has a PhD in reproductive physiology from Louisiana State University and completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Missouri in maternal nutrition and epigenetics. He is the Executive Director of Scientific Affairs at Tomorrow Life Sciences. Now, please do put your questions in the chat, in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, so that we can be monitoring them as we go through. We welcome your questions, but like we say, do put them in the Q&A section so we can see them. And I'm going to hand over now to Michael.
Michael, you're on mute.
I'm very sorry about that. Didn't realize I had mute on. Anyway, Natalie, thank you very much for the introduction. I appreciate that. And welcome. I appreciate y'all taking the time to hear about this research that we've been doing. It was really good to see quite a few names I recognized in the chat box as everybody was joining. I'm going to spend about the next 10 minutes speaking to you about the perils of manual specimen retrieval in IVF biorepositories. All right, so we conducted a study a couple of years back, and this was first reported at ASRM last year, which is what I'm going to demonstrate, show you in terms of the data right now. This is a collaborative assessment to measure variance in cryospecimen retrieval methods across multiple IVF biorepositories. And you can see this was conducted in partnership with San Diego Fertility Center, BIOS, Reproductive Medicine Associates of New York, and Boston IVF. So For materials and methods, we tracked embryologists at 4 U.S. IVF centers, and we observed them while they were performing their daily routine tasks. We took this data after we recorded it, and we analyzed it for the number of times that they had to look at their data record while they were trying to retrieve a specific cane from their doer bank. We also looked at the number of times, which we call pulls, that the canister was lifted into the neck of the doer, and the total time that the canister was held in the neck of the doer. And for each of these pulls, we gave it a quality grade of 1 if the canister remained comfortably low in the neck of the doer, a grade of 2 if the canister was positioned close to the top of the neck but not out of the top of the neck, and a grade of 3 if the canister reached the top of the neck or came out of the doer. We have some examples of this. If you look in your upper left-hand corner, this was given a grade of 1. You can see that it's comfortably down in the neck of the doer so that retrieving the cane was not going to expose the specimens. However, a grade of 2 was assigned to the upper right-hand corner picture here, where you can see that the majority of the cane tops are visible in the picture at approximately the same angle. And then on the bottom is what was assigned a grade 3, where it appears to be 1 inch to 2 inches that the cane tops came out of the top of this doer. So when it comes to results of this, we looked at a total of 95 specimen retrievals, and by specimens, we mean canes. And of these, 89 were from doers with necks, so that 6 of them were from large mouth, large format tanks. The average number of retrievals per site of the 4 sites was 27.8, and the total referrals to the specimen data record was 323. Now, what we mean by the specimen data record is the paper record that is typically sitting next to the embryologist when they are retrieving the cane. So to be clear, this was not looking at the data record to confirm that they had pulled the correct cane. This was actually looking at the data record to make sure that they had the right location, that they had the right canister, and that they had the right tank. And of this, it turned out that there were 3.4 data record referrals per retrieval. So if you add to this the one time that they had to query that database just to know which tank to go to retrieve that cane, we see that over 4 times an embryologist has to look at a data record to find the correct location and lay hands upon a cane in a storage system. Now, if we look at the number of pulls, we see that they are lifting the canister 1.5 times on average for each specimen that's being retrieved from a small format tank. And typically there's about 11.8 seconds that the canister is being held in the neck. However, I would like to call out that the range for this was exceptionally long, with the shortest time in the neck being 2 seconds and the longest time being 50 seconds. So there's very low standardization to that time that was spent in the neck of the tank. When we look at the grade per pull, we see that the grade was about 1.4 plus or minus 0.5. Now, this may not appear to be that impactful, but when we consider that not every single time was the pull done perfectly, where the top of the canes remain comfortably low in the neck, it does open up room for error. Overall, the results of the study show that there is tremendous variance that occurs when specimens are being retrieved from manual doers. So the conclusion of the study was that eliminating the need for repeated manual review of data records and more than one pull per retrieval could help mitigate and lessen the opportunity for any misidentification or mishandling of cryopreserved specimens. Now, from the same study, just to give you a preview of ASRM next week, we have a poster presentation that we're going to be presenting. I advocate that you come by and you see this. This is abstract number 14984. We also have a companion oral presentation that we're going to be doing, which is abstract number 15198, embryologist burnout, physical and psychological symptoms and occupational challenges currently reported by U.S. embryologists. But what I want to give you a glimpse of is the poster that we're going to be presenting, which is Working with Fatigue, Assessment of Cryomanagement Conditions in IVF Biorepositories. So what we did is, using the same data, we looked at how often embryologists are being requested or required to lift heavy objects. You can see here the ubiquitous 2-liter liquid nitrogen buckets that are very common. We do have video evidence that sometimes they require 2 hands to safely lift these. And as you can see in this picture here, sometimes carts are being loaded up with these liquid nitrogen buckets for wheeling at a greater distance. We did not actually look at the amount of time that carts were being pushed or pulled. And if you look at the picture, the image on the right, you see there that there is use of stools that occurs in the management of IVF biorepositories. And oftentimes with the use of stools, the embryologists were still required to stretch or reach to complete the task that they were required to do. And of course, in this image, we have the ubiquitous data record that is sitting on top of the tank next to the one that the embryologist is working in. We also looked at the amount of time that embryologists spent bent over during the operations of an IVF biorepository. So if you look at the higher image there, you can see an embryologist obviously bent over while being recorded for the course of the study. And then also on the lower left-hand side, we have 2 embryologists that were bent over. We did not double the time for the 2 embryologists there, but just to give you a preview of the data that we're going to be presenting next week, is really interesting that embryologists are having to work with such fatiguing conditions in these laboratories, and that not only that, but they're having to do repetitive tasks time and again, so that overall, we're able to state that software-guided automated specimen location or retrieval should lessen the burdens and perils of manual specimen retrieval. So with that, I want to thank you very, very much. And I believe there may be a question or two, which I am happy to answer.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that very informative talk. I wonder if I can ask you a question that I see actually Kim Pomeroy has had the same question. So when you talk about bringing these canes into the neck of the dewar and these smaller dewars, the canes, you know, the samples are inside goblets and the goblets are filled with liquid nitrogen. So why is it that you think they would still be impacted by this lifting when in fact they are still immersed in liquid nitrogen?
Yeah, so very good question. And I would say that the answer overall is that we do not know for sure, right? The assumption has always been, well, it's in liquid nitrogen, so it must be safe. And I think that in general, that is a good assumption, but the data supports the fact that they are time and again being put further and further into a condition where they can be mishandled. And I think more importantly, this data supports the fact that the potential for misidentification and the potential for mishandling is much, much greater when you have manual specimen retrieval, as opposed to automated software-guided specimen retrieval, where the data record is only looked at one time, and where the time to move and retrieve specimens is known very precisely. So overall, yes, we do not have any information that there is any thermal damage that may be occurring with these specimens, but I would say that being as safe as possible is what ultimately it comes down to.
Yeah, I've always wondered whether you can measure turbulence in the liquid nitrogen, because it's a small volume and you're exposing it to air. And of course, it's going to sort of show some, there's evaporation occurring. And I wonder if you can measure the amount of the turbulence and create a model where you can show the impact of that turbulence on the samples. Just the thought. I don't know if it's possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce Glenn Proctor. Glenn has been involved in the fields of IVF and genetics for over 20 years. and has been with Conceptions Reproductive Associates of Colorado since the year 2010. And he is currently operating as the Chief Operations Officer and is an owner of the company. Glenn, I will be looking forward to listening to your lecture. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mina. Yeah, I'm coming to this from like an embryology perspective. We were one of the early adopters of the Tomorrow platform, and so we're just going to talk about how we came to that decision and our experience using that system. So as embryologists, we have a lot of responsibility in the lab in terms of cryo storage. We have to make sure that our specimens are always safe and like a transactional type situation as far as like for thawing or going into the storage. And then, once we leave the lab at the end of the day, until we return the next day, is the overall cryo program safe? And then we have to be concerned about embryologist safety. We are dealing with liquid nitrogen, as far as, procedures go, and then filling and maintaining those, the traditional style of using dewars for storage. We also want to reduce potential for patient and specimen error. So, with dewars, you see in the background here, you're pulling up a cane with multiple goblets and most of the time handwritten labels. So you got to make sure you're identifying the right patient, those kind of things. And then, you have to be meticulous with your chain of custody to make sure that we do have the right embryo, the right patient. And especially if you do a lot of PGTA, the right embryo number. And then, yearly, typically what we would do in the past is do our, semi-annual cryo inventory management. So we go through and make sure our records are correct, and so that we know what we definitely have on site for each patient. So with everything going on in our industry, you see the news stories, you start getting a little paranoid. Are we doing the right thing? Are we, maximizing our total effort to make sure that these specimens and our patients are safe? And so, so some of the things that I questioned was, can I maximize the laboratory space? Because with the increase of volume, with most fertility clinics, you just keep collecting. It seems like every month we're collecting dewars, and we just kept running out of space. So how can I solve that issue? And then can I increase the patient specimen embryology safety? How can I make this whole process safer? We're busier, so there's a lot of mundane things going on in the lab. So how can I make sure that all that is safe? And then how can I have, is there ability to have a accurate inventory and good management as far as when a patient calls and asks, how many embryos or specimens I have left over? Do I have to go pull, a binder or some paperwork or look into the EMR? Is there a way that I can just have the inventory management, very, very clean and accurate? And then at the end of the day, I ask myself, have I done everything in my power with everything that's available in our industry to protect the laboratory and the patients? And so we looked at the Tomorrow tank. And so the picture on the right is what, we have this little hallway of dewars that, was getting more and more crowded. Or I can, get a system that takes a good deal of space, but it's less space than what my doors take up. So most clinics in the US, there is a real estate issue as far as lab size. Most clinics that I've gone into, the lab is kind of small. So it's, where do you put this system? Or if you don't do that kind of system, where can you expand for your cryo, for your cryo space for additional doors? And then you have to decide, are you going to keep your specimens on site, or do you want to go to a biorepository, or both? To be honest, we're in that transitional phase here where we have a Tomorrow tank, but it is getting full. So the question is do we want to get another tank, or do we want to start sending, managing our patients to send some patients to a biorepository, keep some on site, or just keep them all on site? So that's kind of some of the processes that we're currently going through. And we have your legacy patients, we have a lot of embryos on site. And so we have a lot of embryos that haven't been utilized in greater than 5 years for multiple reasons. Patients don't want to discard their embryos or what have you. And so we just keep growing that number of patients that are kind of like inactive. And so that's going to affect how we operate. Do we, there's a lot of clinics that have different systems that they bill more as far as the longer you have specimens. We don't do that. So we're trying to figure out what do we do with these older specimens that probably won't be used. But at the same time, keep those safe and keep the inventory current. And so as the more embryos you collect in your lab, it's just more work for your embryologists, keeping up with that whole inventory management, making sure all the tanks are safe, all that good stuff. And so here at Conceptions, we do about 1,000 frozen embryo transfers a year. And in 2021, of all those frozen embryo transfers we did, only 4% were from 2016 or older. So we have about 3,000 embryos in storage that are older than 2016. And so again, that's when we're kind of in that situation where we're saying, hey, do we need long-term storage or a biorepository? And so what we're thinking about doing is sending 2015 or older embryos to a biorepository. So we were one of the first, like I said earlier, we were one of the first clinics to adopt the Tomorrow Tank, because that's the kind of, we just felt that it would fit our needs the best. And so, there's some work that goes into going into this platform. For us, there was a little bit of construction that we had to do, because we had to, even though we are removing all those doors and creating more space, we had to prepare a certain space for the Tomorrow Tank as far as nitrogen piping, airflow, that kind of stuff. And so there is, Tomorrow was great as far as helping us kind of mitigate those issues. And then what we did, to get rid of all those doers, we moved all those specimens from our current doer to the new system. And so Tomorrow's team of embryologists came, worked with our team, and we went through a process where we moved all of those specimens from their current doers to the new Tomorrow platform. And then there's some EMR integration. We use eIVF. There's a lot of systems you can use, but we wanted our EMR to talk to the Tomorrow platform, so that as embryologists, as you're entering your cryo data work, are thawing embryos from your system, that it would communicate with the Tomorrow software, which makes it nice and streamlined. Billing, how do we, now that we have a new system as far as storing our inventory, how do we keep track of billing patients for storage, those kind of things. Embryology flow, because traditionally, just as simple as thawing in an embryo, you just have the doers there. Like Michael was saying in his talk, you go and you're doing a lot of work, bending over, pulling specimens out of a tank, that kind of thing, where now you go to an automated system that just brings you the beacon that contains the embryo that you need. And so you have to kind of manage, kind of finagle your lab flow to make it work for you and what your procedures are for that day. And then probably the biggest thing that we went through as far as adopting is just buying into the new platform. Embryologists are creatures of habit. And so when you want to change something up on them, they freak out a little bit. And so we went through a process where we're like, all right, this is the new way that we're doing things, and we just need to trust the process. And it's worked out. It's worked out great. Everything's more streamlined. We feel like our specimens are a lot safer. It makes you sleep better at night, knowing that there's a lot of systems in place that are protecting these specimens. And so the management of the software is very intuitive, and it helps us keep track of our current inventory. It's real-time inventory, so we can go into the system and see what we have real time. We can actually print out a daily report if we wanted to. And also there's a digital chain of custody, because the beacons and the way the embryos are stored have RFID tag. And we also, we use that with the RI witness system, those kind of things. So chain of custody is pretty tight, which is very valuable in today's laboratory. And it's all HIPAA compliant and very safe. And then one of the things that was important for me is to be able to know that I've done everything possible to kind of like keep these specimens safe. And so Tomorrow has their Overwatch program, which basically the tank is monitored 24/7. This little graph, this is actually our tank here. I can look at this data at my home computer. And, I can see what the temperatures are, the depth of liquid nitrogen, the usage per day, so I can monitor that. And the nice thing about this software is that it will alert, trends. And so it's not going to alert you when there's actually a critical error. It's going to monitor trends. And so when it sees things kind of creeping out of the norm, you have some time to kind of like correct some things. And in our lab, we actually installed cameras as well. So we have cameras on the equipment, so that if I'm at home and it's at night and I get an alarm or what have you, I can log into this screen, see what's going on with the tank. I can log into my cameras and actually visually see the equipment. And so it's just a better peace of mind, helps you sleep a little better at night. And, for us to go to a completely automated platform has definitely helped our lab and our confidence as far as cryo management. And that's it for me. So thank you for listening in.
I have to say, as a former patient, knowing that your embryologist sleeps better at night, that's very important to hear. And I've also been very privileged to see the kind of old and the new, having got to witness what you've just described with the technology. It's amazing. We've got some questions for you. First up, when you talk about cryo management, can you just talk about the audit process and whether it's 100% of the samples that you check, or it's a percent of the total inventory?
It's 100% of the samples. When we are, I guess I'm assuming this is talking about like the reformatting process from the old way to the new automated platform. And so we go through, it's a process. Tomorrow has a team of embryologists, so they come to our clinic. They have this big nitrogen bath that we just plunge each canister out of each door into this bath. And so we have 2 embryologists going through each patient and verifying the number, making sure that the number of straws are correct, the accession numbers are right, all the identification is done, and then those straws go into a beacon that is RFID tagged and then logged into the Tomorrow system. So going forward, when we take an embryo out of that beacon, we can subtract it from the inventory, or if we cryo multiple days, we can add to a beacon. I find it useful too, because with our RFID tagging, what we do is we do a lot of PGTA. And so we have day 5 and day 6 embryos, or we have patients that do multiple cycles, embryo baking cycles. And so when we go to thaw an embryo, instead of like going through a door and then pulling out multiple straws trying to find the correct date, for example, if you have multiple cycles, you may have 2 number 1s as far as like labeled for PGTA. And so what you can do is with the system, it will only bring us the beacon for the date that we want. So it's another, checking the box that everything's correct. And so we find that very helpful for the way we practice.
That might have helped the next question, which is from Efrosini in Greece. I hope I've said your name right. They've asked, how do you do manual audit twice yearly with such sensitive material?
Same thing. We have a big liquid nitrogen bath. The specimens are submerged, and we're just, we have our labels at the tip of our straw, and so we can just go and just make sure. A lot of the old ways, we just pull out a cane, so we know that we're supposed to have 4 embryos. We see 4 straws in there. We just confirm with one of the straws, and then we just put it right back. But with the tomorrow tank, all that does, it does it for us, so we don't have to do that manual inventory anymore. So it's really nice.
Thank you so much, Glenn. We will have more questions for you later. But it now gives me great pleasure to welcome our next panelist, Stephen L. Katz, MD, has focused his career solely on advanced reproductive care since 1995. He now dedicates his professional life to creating REI Protect, the only risk management and medical professional liability program fully dedicated to REI practices and IVF labs in the US. So, Stephen, I'm going to hand over to you.
Well, Natalie, thank you very much for the kind introduction. And I want to thank Giles and the team for inviting me. Much appreciated. We have an interesting question today, and I'm excited to speak for a few minutes about it. Of course, the question is, can you insure your IVF clinic? As we move forward in time, I think it's going to become more and more difficult. And so that's what we're going to chat a little bit about today, and then open it up for questions. A little bit of background. Many of you know this, but let's repeat it for 30 seconds or so. Insurance is an important part of our society. By definition, insurance accepts and assumes risks in exchange for a cash or a monetary value. It's a powerful tool that we all can use to mitigate personal risk across a broader pool, effectively turning a potentially catastrophic expense into a manageable recurring one. That is really the background to our topic today. So let's break it down a little bit. First, an insurance carrier insures risks they can understand. In their mind, they hope the risk has been around for a very, very long time. The reason they want the risk to be around for a very long time is so that they have historical actuarial data on the loss risk. When they do not have decades of loss data, they get very nervous about accepting the risk. And so you can probably see where we're heading in today's chat. This leads us to our current problem, which is why it's so hard to insure an IVF clinic. So let's break down the risks. In the REI practice, historically, the risk has really been post-surgical complication. But with the advent of IVF technology and the success or increasing success of the IVF laboratory, very few REIs are really performing significant surgery. Some don't really perform surgery at all. So the risk has changed. Really, the risk in an REI practice is relegated to informed consent. Informed consent is such an important part of what we do, walking through all the information that would allow the patient to make an autonomous decision themselves. But I want to emphasize that informed consent is not just giving the patient the information, but making sure the patient understands the information that's being given. There's a modern phrase that I equate somewhat to informed consent, and that is patient expectation. Are the patient expectations met with reality? I think that's actually a piece of valuable informed consent. But really, today's day and age, the risk is in the IVF laboratory rather than the REI practice. By that, we think that a mistake in the IVF lab, because of all of the new procedures and the quantity of procedures being performed, is 6 times greater than an occurrence in the REI practice. In other words, for every incident in the REI practice, we're seeing 6 incidents in the IVF lab. And that's how the risk in the IVF lab has really blossomed over the last couple of years. There are many risks in the IVF lab, but I don't think any risk is any greater than what we have going on in the cryostorage of eggs, sperm, and embryos. Cryostorage used to be an afterthought. Extra embryos were cryostored, and that was really the major inhabitant of the dewar or the tank. These days, cryostorage is at the center of every cycle. With the advent of vitrification for oocytes or freeze-all cycles, every single planned cycle has a cryostorage component. So the entire cryostorage world has blossomed. And that's what's created in part a significant problem for the mainstream insurance industry. As I mentioned at the top of my discussion, insurance carriers do not like risks that they do not understand. The IVF embryo and egg cryo industry has exploded. There are no actuarial tables on loss. And as we all know, there's really no definitive data on what cryopreserved eggs and embryos are worth. So how does the IVF industry share risk? How can we get insurance for the IVF clinic? And this is probably the most important sentence of my chat. The answer is with expertise. We need expertise at both ends of the relationship. We need expertise at the IVF clinic and lab level, so the best practice of medicine is maintained. But we also need expertise at the carrier level for risk management, claims defense, and understanding what they're insuring. So we need expertise both at the clinic and IVF lab level and at the carrier risk management underwriting level. If we have both of those points of expertise, IVF clinics can and will be able to get insured. As I'll mention at the conclusion, if we don't have expertise at both ends, I don't think in the near future the REI practice or IVF lab can get insured. Let's talk about a couple of examples. We need safe cryostorage as an industry. I can't imagine anyone on this webinar right now wouldn't believe that. We must have superior systems in place to identify what cryotissues are being specifically cryopreserved. So when they go to get used, we are 100% confident that the correct specimens are being used. It's the same superior system in place that will identify the cryotissues being stored so that eggs, sperm, and embryos are not mistakenly discarded. They must have written consent to discard. It's these superior systems that are in place that help prevent the wrongful discard. We know that the vast majority of cryo accident or cryo tank incidents are because of some form of human error. That may be a bit of a provocative statement, but safe storage always includes close monitoring of the system and tank. We don't walk into the lab one morning, and find the tank in pieces. Physical tank failure shows signs of weakness or susceptibility over time. Close monitoring picks up these signs well ahead of the danger point. Very important concept. So let's get back to the question, can we insure our IVF clinic? The answer is yes, you can, but it's getting more difficult. Let's just remind ourselves a little bit of what are the specific issues and why has it gotten more difficult. First, malpractice carriers now understand that the IVF lab in particular is a whole new world. No court yet has defined a reasonable value for cryopreserved sperm, eggs, or embryos. So how can an insurance carrier offer appropriate limits and at what cost. Secondly, normal underwriting processes at insurance carriers cannot adequately assess the risk of the IVF practice or their IVF lab. Questions about surgical volume and clinic revenue are generally worthless in trying to underwrite the risk in the IVF space. We need expertise at the carrier level. From the insured perspective, the other half of the equation is equally important. Most insurance carriers try to sell you a gynecology categorized policy. That's what they're used to. This further compounds the problem. While REI is a subspecialty of OBGYN, we know that the REI practice carries different risks. REIs do not perform pap smears, breast exam, or menopausal consults. REIs are not primary care providers. IVF clinics must have REI-based policies with coverage on their special risks, including the risk of the IVF lab and the risk of cryopreserved sperm, eggs, and embryos. Mainstream GYN policies for the physician are worthless in protecting the IVF lab. Lastly, and importantly, defensive incidents and claims in the IVF lab are very specialized. Defining the source of the error alone creates great risk and requires great expertise. An insurance carrier that will sell you a GYN policy will see defense of an REI claim through an OBGYN lens. And that is how so many incidents in our field have fared so poorly. So in conclusion, I'd like to say or focus on a couple of final points and then tell a story, if I may. First, you can get insurance for your IVF program now, and I believe in the future, if your IVF program provides expertise in the best practice of medicine. I've stressed today safe storage of cryopreserved materials as an example. Second, the insurance you buy must come with an expertise in underwriting, an expertise in risk management, incident mitigation, and claims defense. If you don't see expertise on the carrier side, your risk management and incident mitigation will be limited, and your policy protection and defense claim management is likely going to be less than adequate. Third, if you do not provide expertise on the IVF clinic and lab side and seek expertise on the insurance carrier and risk mitigation side, I don't think you'll be able to acquire appropriate professional liability coverage in the very near future. And the very near future may be 2023. It's evolving that quickly. So I appreciate you letting me chat. This is an area near and dear to my heart. And I'd like to tell you a real story with a little bit of humor at the end. One Sunday morning, I received a phone call from a very successful IVF program in the Midwest. Sunday morning. Sadly, they had done an egg retrieval, and in moving from the isolation hood in the laboratory to the incubator, the eggs were dropped on the floor. They were all lost. And so we worked together to truthfully and transparently disclose this to the patient, obviously and correctly show remorse, and try to make the patient as whole as we could. And the doctor did an excellent job. The patient accepted what had happened and went on to have a free repeat cycle with success 2 months later. That's what our program does. We mitigate 24 hours, 7 days a week. And there's some keys to that mitigation, as you heard me say, and that is the truthful and transparent discussion of what had ever happened. So let's say that group had a regular carrier, just a general carrier and a GYN policy. That Sunday morning, they would have called into the risk management 800 number, and they probably would have gotten a very lovely person on the other end. And they would have told the story. we drop the eggs on the floor. And the risk management person, probably a nurse at the carrier, would have probably said, oh my God, can you run to Trader Joe's and get another dozen real quick? So for those in the US, that's the Trader Joe's story. Most of our programs know that story because while it's humorous, I think it really hones in on what risk management and what expertise really looks like on a Sunday morning. So I want to thank everybody for allowing me to speak. It was a pleasure. I'm not a spokesperson for Trader Joe's, but everybody in the US probably shops at Trader Joe's. And that's a story I tell frequently. And while I can't get any real feedback on this Zoom, I hope I put a smile on your face. Thank you again, Giles. Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to speak on this important topic.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this very provocative, thought-provoking talk. You mentioned something that sort of struck me as something I had not thought about before, that safe storage of cryopreserved material might actually become a condition for insurance companies to insure IVF programs. That has never been the case, has it?
It has never been the case, but I'll be even more provocative, Mina, and say to you, it is becoming mandatory. And the reason is because in order for insurance carriers, as I said, to understand and accept the risk, there has to be certain mechanisms of safety in place. And this is one of them. Do I think a witnessing program in the IVF lab is coming as well? I do. But I think cryostorage and safe cryostorage in superior systems like we're talking about today, I may go on record by the end of 2023, I think it may be mandatory.
Yeah, actually, that's in a way good to hear, because I think that kind of an attitude toward cryostorage within IVF clinics has been lacking. You know, the attitude that this is we are acting as biorepositories, whether or not we saw ourselves as biorepositories. So very interesting. There are so many questions for you. We will get to many of them, I hope, at the end when we open the Q&A. In the meantime, thank you again for a very nice discussion. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Before I do, I should mention that very importantly, this session has been sponsored kindly by Tomorrow Life Sciences. And our next speaker, Robert Perkinson, is the Executive Director of Global Biorepository Operations at Tomorrow. His career spans over 20 years in both academia and biotechnology, with a particular focus on improving cell handling, monitoring, and safekeeping. And so we look forward to your talk today on transforming offsite storage for IVF patients and clinics. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mina, and hello to the i3 community. It's so great to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Giles and my fellow co-speakers and the panelists for the opportunity. As Mina said, I am a trained molecular and cell biologist. I've designed and run biorepositories for large pharma companies under strict FDA and quality management oversight. And I've stored anything from nucleic acids to human stem cells for cell and gene therapy to therapeutic antibodies in the master cell banks that produce them. But today, I'd really like to spend some time chatting about how we, as an industry, can come together to enable scale, safety, and security in cryospecimen management. And while I'm not an embryologist, and frankly, after seeing you all in action all over the globe, I am in constant awe of what you do day in and day out. I feel privileged to work side by side with you. You are those single cell surgeons that create families who struggle with infertility. And as a father too, that really resonates with me. What a terrific calling. What a better sense of purpose in a profession. So with that being said, I got to make the lawyers happy. So here's my disclosure. I do work for Tomorrow Life Sciences. So the projected demand for fertility services is massive. And we know that, mostly due to the success of vitrification and the growing demand for egg freezing and IVF. Large IVF clinics and clinic networks are actually capping treatment cycles right now due to these capacities of space issues and the scarcity of trained embryologists like you who often strain to handle these issues. Safe and scalable standardization through technology-enabled on and off-site cryomanagement is warranted. And in my humble opinion, creating that higher standard of care in the lab, in the IVF lab, is long overdue. So an end-to-end off-site storage solution ensures unique specimen identification, an immutable chain of custody, and the safe, controlled, automated storage and retrieval of a clinic's irreplaceable cells. This cannot be our future. Fertility clinics are patient-focused treatment centers, not long-term biorepositories. But as my co-speakers have said, that's what essentially they've inadvertently become, accidental biorepositories. Storing and filling crowded doers underneath desks and lab benches is a stopgap. It's not a solution. So again, scalable and sensible cryomanagement of embryos and gametes needs to occur. So now is the time to modernize. We need to move beyond manual monitoring and paper and pen record keeping. And we've reached an inflection point where the status quo is just no longer safe, and it's certainly not sustainable. So we need to ask ourselves the hard question: what is the best use of our time, our resources, our real estate, especially in urban markets where we're on 5th and 6th floors of high rises? And what is the best use of our training? Why on earth are we keeping embryos on site for decades? That there has to be a better way that helps embryologists to cope. Manual doers, handwritten tiny labels, limited monitoring, analog record keeping, and burdensome administration. So case in point, and as you've heard from my colleague, Dr. Collins, 2 recent studies cited embryology fatigue and burnout. So of 59% of embryologists who were polled, they reported considerable level of occupational anxiety. And even more telling, almost 30%, almost a third of embryologists, when asked, were unable to locate or were unsure of the specimens in their storage facility. And that's just not acceptable. Patients are starting to ask questions. So typical questions that you'll see on this slide: how do you label each person's cryotop so you're sure you have the right one? What if they mixed up the embryos? Do you ever have to change the liquid nitrogen? How do you check to make sure you have enough staff coverage or liquid nitrogen itself on long weekends? And I can't tell you how many times I hear of embryologists needing to come into the clinic during Thanksgiving or the holiday season to fill the doers or to swap a cylinder or respond to an alarm. I've been through that anxiety, and it is no picnic. And then oftentimes patients just offer up statements. I just know kids are getting mixed up all over the place. Can you talk about human error and the mix-up that could happen? So as we said before, the embryologist's core competencies are not long-term tissue banking or multi-location specimen management and transport. You are helping people build their families. Fertility clinics need to leverage technology. If they leverage the technology, they can safely scale their operations using a connected on and off-site model, allowing them to focus on patient care. So what does a complete cryo management solution look like? So for your consideration, I do present this slide. Best practice in my mind is integrated specimen management through the use of advanced technology, some automation, and integrated software and labware that come together. It provides automated, scalable cryo storage, both on-site and off-site. It enables that digital chain of custody, those breadcrumbs that are left every time an embryologist touches a specimen, whether they're freezing, whether they're thawing, whether they're sending, whether they're importing. And through the use of intuitive software, we can guide those embryologists, and we can also integrate EMRs and other types of software programs into that software management solution. We provide huge gains in terms of security, impenetrable data security, compliance, GDPR in the EU, as well as HIPAA compliance here in the US. And again, as Glenn so succinctly and professionally said, the inventory is updated in real time. You don't need to put it in the cryo storage inventory. You don't need to put it again in the EMR. There's no double entry. And it provides a complete audit trail that you can have at the touch of the button. You don't have to go into the doers and with your Excel spreadsheet or your paper and pen, ensure that what is supposed to be in those doers is actually reflected on your paperwork. You also need to have proactive monitoring. You need to make sure that the receptacles that contain these precious specimens are well maintained. And if things go awry, you are automatically aware of that before that happens. If things are being transported through a courier, you need to have that telemetry that shows where they are, what temperature they are, whether the mushroom is tilted or not, whether it's been opened. All of those types of things you need to have, because they're most at risk when they're being transported, not when they're in the tank. And lastly, you need to be able to scale. You've seen the picture where I showed where you see doers under the desks and crowded all over the place. I honestly don't know how you could even fill some of those ones way back in the back. So again, as you have an off-site model, and again, as Glenn alluded to, maybe you set a line in the sand. All of your specimens prior to 2016, you send off-site, and then the folks who haven't gotten pregnant, the folks who are more transactional, you store on-site with the same type of system. And all of this needs to be validated within a clinical setting. So this is my summary. How do we go from manual to automated? The status quo is no longer safe. I propose now is the time to modernize and transform by adopting these advanced technologies that are used in other fields, in biotech, in pharma, FDA-regulated spaces. We have to go from reactive to proactive. And with the amount of cryo inventory the clinics are currently managing, we cannot afford to be simplistic with our monitoring. Proactive, always-on technology with redundancies in place will ensure the ability to identify and address any deviations from expected system performance before those problems arise. We need to go from static to scalable. And existing manual systems can't safely scale to meet the rising clinic demands of cryostorage. Moving to those automated, scalable, on-site and off-site systems enable clinics to safely treat the increasing numbers of patients that seek treatment. Static to scalable. So siloed systems that don't speak to each other, they create an unnecessary burden on embryologists. As I said before, double data entry, doing regular audits to ensure all the records are in sync. It's not the best way to grow the industry. So by having and adopting an off-site and on-site solution that integrates seamlessly, it reduces that risk and it provides transparency for both the clinic as well as the off-site biorepository. So And then in terms of reactive to proactive, I've already covered that. But just to kind of summarize, it's so nice to be in a space that is thinking about adopting much more tighter controls on temperature and liquid nitrogen and handling and safety and PPE. Honestly, I was a bit appalled by seeing the lack of PPE on folks' hands and no safety glasses. It just sends me shivers because I've seen the consequence of when you don't have PPE on. But I just want to end by saying thank you for your attention. This is a great series. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to answering any of your questions. And if you don't want to ask for within this forum, I openly invite anyone within the i3 community to reach out. Cheers.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you so much. We've got a lot of questions and we are going to be inviting all the panel to join us in a moment. If you still have questions that you haven't yet put in the Q&A box, please do. Robert, I've got one here for you now though. Someone's asking, do you have an embryologist on site? I would not trust anyone else to hand me over embryos.
That's a great question. I wouldn't either. So these are vitrification straws with a half a microliter on the tip of a spatula. And embryologists get that. Embryologists trust embryologists. I've hired many embryologists to curate the specimens within the biorepository, and I wouldn't have it otherwise.
Thank you. So we're now going to invite all our panelists back to put their cameras on, their mics on, as Mina and I try and work our way through this massive questions of what's been an amazing session.
Yes. Natalie, did you want to start with another question, or would you like me to?
Well, I mean, I'm happy to ask Robert if you'd like. I can ask Robert another question, or we can go back to the start. Robert, do we still have you here whilst this is fresh?
I'm still here. I'm sorry. I just shut my video off.
There was a question about the revenue that's lost by the storage billing to the clinics.
And what? Oh, I see it right now. Okay. So hold on. Let me go into that question list. What? So there's a question. What about the revenue that is lost by the storage billing to the clinic? What are the economical gains? Do clinics lose money because they don't get storage money? So there are some models out there that where they do lose all of the revenue. But we adopt a different model. The clinic retains the relationship with the patient, and they retain part of that revenue. And of course, there's going to be a cost to sending off site, but you're really offsetting those that loss of revenue in terms of gained efficiencies, embryology resources, space, time, infrastructure, greater transparency, less risk. So you also have the ability to extend the number of years that a clinic has with a particular clinic or a patient, I'm sorry. So while, yes, there are costs to sending things off site, I think the value that you get from adopting an off-site biorepository model is something that should be mentioned as well and really highlighted.
I'm curious, Robert, about this concept of what you called connected on and off-site cryostorage. And in the light of what Stephen has said, my question is, why should they be connected? If you want to reduce your liability, what you would do is send everything off-site and shift that liability onto an off-site storage facility. Why would you maintain that? And the question to Stephen, and I think this has been brought up in the Q&A as well, would the clinic be still responsible and be held liable if something goes wrong with the specimens off-site? So if you maintain that connection, that liability remains. No?
I think those are great questions. I think that clinic that Cynthia is on the line, I think that she'd be much more articulate in the answer why on-site and off-site. Is Cynthia on the line?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. No, that's a great question. And I think it's one that the clinics today really have to kind of answer for themselves. So the current model that exists, you can send patients off to a separate location for offsite long-term storage. But there's a cost to that, right? There's a cost to your long-term connection with the patient, because if you send those specimens off sites, they're not necessarily inclined to come back to you if they want to use those embryos in 5 years. They can then choose to use those embryos and send them elsewhere. And you lose the communication with the patient, and you lose the financial revenue from the patient. So if you send that patient to a certain storage facility, then they take over 100% the billing for the patient, and the clinic loses all revenue. Now, in that situation, you're right, Mina, the clinic then removes that liability, from their entity. However, what we've set up is a different way of doing it. We can allow you to maintain that communication with the patient. We can allow you to maintain that revenue stream from the patient, all the while holding those specimens off-site to reduce your in-clinic burden of managing those and storing those specimens. So we can reduce your square footage. We can reduce your, the labor that it takes, the liquid nitrogen that it takes to maintain all of that. We can take that off-site and take care of those specimens for you and allow you to maintain revenue and communication with the patient. So there's two ways to do it. We've built a model where the clinic can certainly choose between one of those two. They can give up all communication and billing directly from the patient and send to us, or they can maintain that billing and revenues, stream with the patient and have us hold the specimens for them.
So I'm going to challenge you again by bringing in Christianna Makri, who has had experience in auditing their cryostorage and looking at the rate of return of patients and percentages of people who will actually come back to the center to follow a pregnancy after a pregnancy has occurred and a live birth has occurred. And Christianna, can you add to this discussion?
Yes, hi. We had cryostorage management to our clinic between the years of 2016 and 2020. And we have seen that almost 60% of patients that had a freeze-all policy and haven't done first embryo transfer have not returned to the clinic yet. Some patients that had the first baby, about 26% hasn't returned for a second try. And even more, we had a lot of patients with a negative test, no baby yet, that haven't returned. We also were trying to maintain the contact with the patients to see if what they're going to do with the samples after the 5-year first era, and it's really hard to keep track with everybody, and the cryostorage just keeps getting bigger and bigger. Yes, it's expanding. So we are really trying to improve the cryostorage, the facility, the monitor system, and the tracking. It's becoming more and more difficult with with everyday routine. I really believe that every clinic has a duty to do a detailed audit to assess the demands on space and on the legacy samples, what we're going to do with those patients.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, right? I mean, you can look at in every clinic, you should do this. You should pull a report and you say, here's all my frozen embryo replacement, my frozen embryo transfer dates, and then balance that against here are all the cryo dates for those specimens. All right. And so you can make an internal assessment like you guys did. How many times do you need a sample that's been frozen for 3 years, or 5 years? And so for a clinic, which is primarily a treatment center, you can then decide, what are those active family building tissues that you would probably need, or want close by, and then what portion of the inventory might be considered for sending off site because the transaction rate, the number of times you need to access those samples is lower. So, back to you, Mina, the model where you can send them off site and then still maintain some revenue for billing is something that we've developed. You are always welcome to send them off site and give up 100% of the storage billing. That's for the clinic to decide. But one of the things that we're talking about is kind of making that determination of what makes sense to keep on and what makes sense to keep off, because you're absolutely right, the inventories are exploding. We're now freezing tissues that are, many of them, certainly for egg freezing patients, are never going to come out of storage, right? Which we never did before. We froze embryos for patients that wanted to become parents. Now we're freezing eggs for patients that maybe want to become parents. We don't really know. So we're just rapidly increasing the amount of tissue that we need to store. And does it really make sense to be, now I just think, Rob mentioned it, we're at an inflection point. Like, do we want to maintain tissues for decades? Or do we want to consider some of them off-site and maintain our status as a clinical treatment center?
Anastasia, can I just invite you to comment on the UK kind of perspective, whether the thought has been put into space, whether there is the space, whether the thought for the future has been considered?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me as well. The UK law has just changed in July this year. And we've been waiting for this for years because it's really good for the patients, to increase storage to 55 years for eggs, embryos, and sperm. So we have seen a change in the type of patients and in the age that the patients come through for cryopreservation of gametes, especially eggs. So we are seeing younger patients that, as Cynthia said, they may or may not use them in the future, but they want to store. So it is a big problem, I think, especially for units like ourselves that we've been for decades storing samples and for decades treating patients. And I have to plan, for example, for how we're going to grow in the next 5 years, and I have to plan based on what events are going to happen in the world, in science, in law, everything in regulation. So these are the things that obviously worry us, because we want to do our best. We want to provide safe environment for the cryo storage. And I'm very happy to hear. I'm very happy for this webinars. I'm really excited with everything that's been said today, and very inspired. So I hope more come, because this is really important and really serious issue that could potentially, we all need to face worldwide.
Thank you, Anastasia. I think we're going to delve back into some of our previous questions from our earlier panelists. I'm going to invite Michael to make sure you're unmuted. Just go back to a question that we had for you. This is about temperature. What temperature should be at the neck of the dewar if we are to retrieve or read labels, search for samples in our existing dewars? So we're just going back into the past for a little bit.
Yeah, so I think similar to the earlier question, we have to remember that in the dewars with the cane and goblet, they're in liquid nitrogen. And we know for sure that handling with cane and goblets, if done correctly, is safe, and the temperature should not fluctuate at all. We have some internal data that supports that in the cane and goblet, nitrogen temperature is maintained for approximately 2 minutes when outside of a doer sitting on a bench top. In terms of the actual neck itself, there was some, or there's been a fair number of reports, but in essence, somewhere between the top of the neck is about 2 to 12 degrees Celsius, and down about 6 inches lower is 180, 192 degrees. This is from SAC in 1974. So there's a standard gradient in between those two temperatures. But if we think about the data that I presented earlier, where the real difference in the cane top level was approximately 4 to 6 inches, then you could potentially be reaching the point where there could be this questionable temperature gradient. And I think one of the other questions that had come through was, what is the effect of the liquid nitrogen level within the doer and the temperature within the neck? We didn't develop any data on that specifically ourselves, but I think we all are pretty aware that there is a gradient from the liquid vapor interface all the way up. So lower the liquid level in the doer, the more likely it is that your neck temperature is going to be higher. And so all of this together means that if you have less standardization in how canes are being pulled from doers, it is more likely that you're going to run up against one of those guardrails. And I think it's a great thing if we try to stay away from the guardrails overall.
Great. There are a number of technical questions here being asked by our audience, and of course, anyone who has knowledge can answer, but I think Glenn and Cynthia, you might be able to address some of these. And there are, some of them are short questions. Michael Reed says, have you had false alarms with this system? With the system?
We haven't had any false alarms. Really only true alarm that we've had is I got a call in the middle of the night, but that there was something with the system, but it was just our IT guys rebooting the server that night, and we lost internet connection for about 5 minutes.
Right.
But it called me and alerted me, which I kind of appreciated.
Right. Is there an engineer on hand if something goes wrong?
We have an engineer that's here in Colorado that we can call, and they're here within 15 minutes.
But on tomorrow's...
But I'm not, Cynthia might be able to answer other locations.
We have engineers on call 24 hours a day, and we have them regionally located in the US so that we can get there perhaps very quickly or even in a few hours.
How many samples can each vessel contain, and how many vessels do you have in your clinic? This is addressed to Glenn.
Vessels as far as beacons,
Yeah,
cryo beacons maybe.
I'm not sure, but I think maybe actually dewars, or if they're talking about the tomorrow system, maybe, yeah.
So the beacon, which is our version of the cane and goblet, it holds up to eight cryo devices. And we have two different automated systems. One of them holds over 4,000 of these, and one of them holds about 1,300 of these. So if you think of this as a cane, you can do the math in your doers.
Okay. So there's a question about RFID and whether the old system can be retrofitted with RFID tags. I'm not sure if you can answer that.
I don't think that doers can be retrofitted with RFID tags like while they're in the tank, but you can do RFID tags for identification once they come out of the door, for sure.
So if you move the straws from the goblets to a beacon, you could RFID the beacon, no?
Just the beacon that contains all the straws is RFID, but not the individual straw.
The individual, okay. And are there devices now that come with RFID that can be used with the Tomorrow system?
Not at this time. Maybe in the future.
Okay. Natalie, do you have a burning question?
I wanted to just ask Charissa if you wanted to add anything to we haven't spoken with you yet.
Thanks very much, Natalie. I was just thinking how interesting it was that when Michael was talking about quantifying how many times we actually lift the samples in and out of the tank, and also about the record keeping. So how many times we're actually looking at the records and double checking everything, and the time it takes and the stress you're under in those kind of situations. If you've got lots and lots of thaws that you're supposed to be doing in the morning, you're checking all the records, and then you're going to each single patient, checking it's in there, checking that against. There's so much manual checking that you're doing that it kind of like a system like the Tomorrow platform just seems like a really innovative way of kind of avoiding all those risks and time spent from an embryologist side.
Yeah, I'd like to amplify that for just a second, and that the data I presented, just to be clear, it was not the double witnessing, right? This was checking and confirming that you were looking in the correct location. One of the drawbacks from the study that we did is that it was completely observational, and we were completely impartial. We just had the cameras, we collected the data. When we analyzed the data, one of the things we did realize is that the speed to the specimen seems to be related to the number of canes that are in the canister. Unfortunately, that was not a explicit parameter that we collected data on. But certainly for the person who found that cane in 2 seconds in the video, we could see that it was the only cane that was in that canister. So it was pretty easy to identify that you had the correct cane in that situation. Some of the other data that I did not present is that the longest time to retrieval of a specimen was of a cane from taking the cork out of the dewar to actually laying your fingers on the correct cane was 10 minutes and 7 seconds. And in that situation, it turned out that the cane was in the dewar that they were looking in, but it was in the wrong canister. They ended up having to look at all 6 canisters twice. So each canister was lifted twice and everything. If you think about the number of specimens that did not have to be handled or lifted into the neck of the dewar just to get to that one specimen, it's mind-boggling. And so that, I think, predominantly is where automation becomes very, very important, because it's one look, one click, and that's it, you're done.
One other one for Cynthia. Philip Chan is asking, is there video of the Tomorrow system available? It's difficult to imagine the Tomorrow equipment such as beacon, platform, software, etc. The video can be maybe added in later, he says, but Cynthia, is there video?
Yes, and we can add one in later. Yeah,
and
absolutely.
On the website or on the
our website is being redone, but we'll make one available for the I3 members.
Yeah, so they can picture what it actually looks like.
Absolutely.
About 10 minutes left, so I think we're going to try and do a bit of a quick run through some of the questions. I've got one here from Carol Losher in Ireland. She says, what EMRs does the Tomorrow Tank integrate with? Is it all? How do you link the RA witness code barcode tags to the straw RFID, or both used for separate purposes, witnessing and storage independently?
So 2 good questions. I'll run through them quick. We are integrated with several EMR platforms, to list a few: Mellowood, eIVF, Artisan, Fertility Pro, Meditex, Resource, GE Centricity. We're in the works with a couple of others. And as far as integrating with other witness systems, we are building those integrations. So yes.
So
Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask if there is a biorepository available in the UK that anybody knows of, if that's something that's coming.
It is coming. It is in progress. We have one now available in the US, and it's located in New York.
Along those lines, as Charissa was mentioning, I see a note that mentions automated systems from Sophie Bird from the UK. I wonder why the automated cryostorage systems are not used in the UK at all. Is that true?
No one is using ours yet. We are building up businesses there and talking to clinics actively. So I expect we'll be live in the UK very soon.
Has anyone else knowledge of this? What kinds of automated systems may be in use in the UK or other parts?
Anastasia, Charissa?
I don't think there is any any other in the UK automated cryostorage system.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are other automated systems like electronic systems, RFID tag, like electronic witnessing, but that's been out a lot, for many years. So I think cryostorage is new and
right,
a new area to automate. So good.
Yeah, I understood from some conversations I was having at the Alpha meeting that we just had in Spain, that many countries in Europe and also in the UK, that there's no charge for cryostorage. How do you think that impacts the operations of the clinics?
So, at least from a company perspective, we have several different business models, that we can work with different clinics. There are certain clinics, you're absolutely right, it's government funded. There's, in the UK, you have NHS contracts. So there's different ways of dealing with the introduction of technology into a certain clinic. And we have definitely different options available to work with clinics. We want to be able to offer this to all clinics because we think it's a better way to manage cryostorage, and we want to make it available to everybody. So we have different ways of presenting that into different markets.
Can I bring in Stephen for a minute? There are several questions about insurance. When a clinic is insured, does that mean that the individuals working are also covered? And there's a lot of concern about what is, I guess, our personal liabilities, and people who work as independent contractors in IVF labs, per diem embryologists, etc. Are they liable?
In the United States, the policy is written for the entity. And so if the entity, the practice, is different than the entity for the laboratory, then unfortunately, that policy is unlikely to have coverage for the laboratory, even for those employed by the practice entity. In the US, many clinics have separate entities for the laboratory versus the RAI practice to lower the risk on the IVF practice. That entity has to be listed on the policy. So that's sort of the answer within the employee structure. Independent contractors who go visit a clinic per diem or per week for an IVF lab excuse me on that, they will not have coverage. We instituted in our program an endorsement for independent contractors to have coverage. Because I've had this question before, Mina, and I think with the scarcity of embryologists, there are more and more embryologists that help out at other clinics. So we instituted coverage for independent contractors when they perform their duties at outside clinics. But I'm not sure any other carrier or policy provides for that. We added it specially about 12 months ago.
Thank you very much. There's so much more to talk about, but unfortunately we have run out of time. I would encourage everyone to listen to the podcast that will follow this session, related to this session. And I think that one of the things we need to consider is that we have a global audience, and that there are so many different aspects that are different from country to country, region to region. And somehow we have to be able to address people's concerns in those particular areas. And hopefully we will be able to do that in future sessions. In the meantime, I would like to thank first our sponsor, the sponsor for this session, Tomorrow Life Sciences. And I would like to thank all of the individuals who took part in this webinar, my co-hosts and the panelists, Natalie Silverman, Christianna Makri, Charissa Watchorn, Anastasia Mania, right? Okay. I said okay. And Cynthia Hudson. Our presenters for their wonderful presentations, Dr. Michael Collins, Glenn Proctor, Dr. Stephen Katz, and Robert Perkinson. And of course, not forgetting our wonderful team behind the scenes at I3. Thanks to the organizing committee, who are Jacques Cohen, Peter Nash, Marianne Cervantes, Thomas Elliott, Giles Palmer, and Fran Farley. Thank you so much. And now to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you for all you've done. Thank you to Tomorrow, as you've just said. Mina mentioned the podcast, which if you're yet to subscribe to, it's available wherever you get your podcasts. We'd love you to listen, rate, review it, and share it, as it helps spread the word of the amazing work that I3 do. Now, the next session is all about lab and quality management with a twist of technology. It's called Quality Inside and is sponsored by the Reflections app from IVF QC. You can find out more information at ivfmeeting.com. And thank you all so much for giving us your time. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.